Hello and welcome to today's IFIM webinar, the year of the COVID vaccines. My name, as you can see, is Eleonora Rosati, and I am the director of the Institute and a professor of intellectual property law at Stockholm University. It is our great pleasure today to welcome such esteemed guests to discuss the issues surrounding the COVID vaccines and help us also understand how the question that I think is in everyone's mind, when and how we will get out of this COVID situation, can be answered. With our speakers, we will be reviewing the legal and regulatory challenges facing the COVID vaccines and explore issues facing indeed regulation, intellectual property, and legal liability. So let me start by introducing you to today's speakers. So we shall start with Camilla Applegren. She's a partner at Mannheimer Swartling in Stockholm, and she's part of the Healthcare and Life Sciences Group. Then we have Marco de Morpurgo, who is a partner at DLA Piper in Rome and is the co-chair of the global life science sectors and specializes in government regulation of the life sciences. Then we have Dr. Kathleen Liddell, who is the Herschel Smith Reader in Intellectual Property Law at the University of Cambridge, where she also leads the Center for Law, Medicine and the Life Sciences. And then we have Sally Shorthose, who is a partner at Berdenberg in London. She specializes in transactional IP matters, and she brings with her experience from both private practice and in-house roles, having worked at a few pharmaceutical companies. And then we have our chair, Frantzeska Papadopoulou, who is an associate professor at Stockholm University, and she specializes in patent and regulatory rights issues. Before I tell you a bit more about today's event, let me extend my gratitude to our LLM students, Rihanna Harvey and Alex Mura, who have been helping putting together today's event. So thank you for all your work. I would like also to extend my gratitude to Alva Wester, IFIM amanuensis and a student at Stockholm University. And I would like to thank the IFIM board and our chair, Professor Per Jonas Nordell, for all the support to today's event. So let's speak about the webinar that is about to start. Our goal is indeed to review the regulatory and legal issues facing the COVID vaccines, and we would like to have a discussion among the speakers under the chairing of Frantzeska, and we would like for this discussion to be as interactive and lively as possible. So we would like to invite all attendees to share their comments, ask their questions by using the Q&A function. If anyone has any technical issues, please use the chat function. Now, without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Frantzeska, whom I thank very much for accepting to be part of today's event. Frantzeska, over to you.
Very much, Eleonora, and thank you for the invitation. And it seems to me one does not need to explain why a panel discussion on COVID-19 vaccines is both timely and important. And undeniably, COVID-19 has influenced our lives, the way we function, we work and behave. And it is also clear that hopes for the future, for some kind of a normal life conditions again, are closely related to the success of vaccines and actually to managing to vaccinate the population as fast as possible. And we have followed the race of companies the past few months in this respect. We have followed the regulatory race for getting marketing authorization, and also the pros and cons of different national solutions when it comes to, for instance, priority list of vaccinations. I think also the issue of COVID-19 vaccines is exciting for a number of reasons. One, of course, is the pace under which developments took place. As we know, normally vaccines take 6 to 9 years to go through clinical developments and authorization. And in the case of COVID vaccines, we already have, just a year after the pandemic broke out, 3 authorized vaccines. Of course, there are a lot of theories as to why this was possible, and the explanations are multi-layered. A combination of the fact that we were able very fast to disclose the genetic sequence of the virus, the fact that COVID-19 is so close to previous COVID viruses, and also of course, the engagement of governments, national governments, the public funding when it comes to, for instance, manufacturing capacities and so on. And we also need to say that we have 3 vaccines that are already on the market. We also have 250 in development, and 50 vaccines are in fact in human trials phases, and around 20 in phase 3 in the clinical trials. There are also several calls for cooperation in order for whatever comes out of the regulatory procedures to be easily accessible and at good pricing models. There is an admirable mobilization of unprecedented extent of public and philanthropic funding. Billions have been invested into vaccine development by means of advanced purchase agreements and EU framework program grants and tax incentives, and the list is long. And although we can count our blessings in this process, there are also several issues to consider, and I hope we will do both during this discussion. Because COVID-19 crisis has also revealed the complicated structures and relations between the industry and the governments, the licensing agreements, and the conditions under which these vaccines are distributed and made available. And needless to say, intellectual property rights are, of course, of major importance when we discuss access and pricing, and the same goes for regulatory rights. And I find it quite interesting that in the past, regulatory procedures was an area of law discussed only by specialists, and I was supposed to be one of the nerds that were interested in different forms of marketing authorization. Nowadays, we find concepts such as provisional marketing authorizations, follow-ups, and so on in newspapers and in the mouths of almost everyone. So I think I will start with that because it seems to me that it's kind of the starting point for the vaccine discussion. And I'd like to ask Marco if he can explain to us how the approval of new vaccines work in the EU, and how have these the currently available vaccines been authorized?
Hi, thanks very much, Frantzeska and Eleonora and everyone for the invitation and participation. I'm very happy to open up with indeed a bit of an overview. We've seen roughly who is among the attendees, and there are some specialists who probably know all of this already, but some may not be up to speed indeed on what it means to have an authorization for a new vaccine. There was a lot of talking about it in the press, so I'll try in a few minutes to give a bit of an overview of how things work. It may sound basic, but a vaccine from a regulatory point of view is a medicinal product. Even from a medical perspective, it's a different type of product. From a regulatory one, it is a medicine. As such, it is a regulated product. You cannot sell it on the market just like you're selling any other unregulated product, but before you're able to do so, you need to obtain an authorization from the government. So companies that develop vaccines, they do their R&D, they do their clinical trials, they gather data. And normally, under normal circumstances with other medicines, once you have all the data you need, you will apply for a marketing authorization to the competent authority. Competent authority may be the member state pharmaceutical regulatory authority, or it can be for sort of EU-wide centralized marketing authorizations, the EMA and the European Commission. So as I said, normally the full standard marketing authorization procedure is lengthy. It lasts 210 working days. And once you have all the data, you submit it to the regulator for review and approval. This has been different in the experience of COVID-19 vaccines. First of all, there's been an acceleration at the regulatory level. There's been a combination of companies being able to take advantage of the so-called accelerated assessment, expedited review, which shortens the duration of the regulatory procedure from 210 days to 150 days. As I said, in combination with the rolling review procedure, we've seen the press talking about that. What does that mean? It means essentially the company that develops the vaccine does not have to generate all of the data before submitting the application, but as soon as they have a discrete set of data throughout the R&D process, they can already send it to the authority so that the authority can start reviewing that sort of set of data while the company continues to work on the R&D process. And also the advantage of this, there is somewhat of a dialogue between the company and the authority, so that the authority receives the company receives some feedback throughout the R&D process which is helpful. So at the time when the company has sufficient amount of data, the speed will be much higher because the authority already has reviewed a good amount of the clinical trial data supporting the MA application. Another important point, perhaps, in the case of the 3 vaccines that have been authorized by the Commission for the EU, none of them has a full standard marketing authorization, but a conditional marketing authorization. We see that in the press. What does it mean? A conditional marketing authorization is based on less data, less amounts of data compared to the standard and the ordinary situation. Still, the authority will make sure that there is enough data to support safety, quality, and efficacy, and in particular, the risk balance, the risk benefit balance is positive, despite the more limited amount of data, and it's justified based in situations of unmet medical need and sort of public health emergencies. So indeed, these MAs are conditional MAs. They're valid for 1 year. They can be renewed, and they can be turned into full marketing authorizations. Perhaps to complete the picture, we have seen, especially before the end of 2020, the UK authorizing one of the first vaccines. The press was talking about an approval, an authorization. That's actually something different. It's not a marketing authorization under EU law. It's an authorization to supply an unapproved medicine. Indeed, the Commission still had exclusive competence for a biotechnological vaccine, such as Pfizer's one, before the end of the year and also later on. But the UK decided nonetheless to approve the supply in the UK of a non-authorized medicine, so without a marketing authorization. That's slightly different. It may seem, as Frantzeska was saying, a comment for regulatory nerds, but it actually has a lot of practical implications. The member states haven't used this option, which is provided for by Article 5.2 of the directive. Generally, although we have seen a few member states, including the Czech Republic, just before the end of the year, issuing similar authorizations, for example, with respect to Pfizer's vaccines, 6 doses before the update of the label at the EU level. Or very recently, Hungary announced that they may approve the supply of non-authorized COVID vaccines in presence of certain circumstances, for example, the availability in more than 3 countries, and so on and so forth. So again, the devil is in the detail, and I hope that was useful to set the scene in terms of what it means to authorize a new vaccine on the EU market or the market of a particular member state.
Thank you, Marco. I was just thinking a follow-up question. Have you seen these very fast procedures in any other case, or is this really a COVID-19 trend?
Good point, Frantzeska. We have certainly seen, the EMA especially is a very collaborative, a very pragmatic regulatory authority. We have seen it act faster than the ordinary in other circumstances. But what we have seen this year in terms of speed of development and interaction and approval of new medicines of this caliber, to me, it's really been unprecedented.
And do you find there are any risks with that? I mean, you were talking also about approval of non-authorized medicines and vaccines. Would there be any pitfalls with this amount of flexibility from the part of the member states?
So in general, I mean, I would say that the European regulators, and including the MHRA in the UK, they're very solid and reputable regulators. I'm not a scientist, so I just comment based on my understanding as a lawyer, as an advisor, and also to the extent I'm allowed to comment on these aspects. But even a conditional marketing authorization is based on solid evidence. As I said, it's a balance. Maybe we don't have the full data to make a thorough risk-benefit analysis based on full data, but even based on what we know, what we have, the authorities concluded that the risk profile is sufficient and it's sort of adequate compared to the benefits to have the vaccine immediately available. And as far as I've been understanding and reading how things are, the safety profile of all the vaccines that have been approved is solid and sufficient. And I see Sally's raised her hand. Maybe she has a comment on that.
A sort of expansion, obviously. I see if I'm coming from a slightly different place because I am in the UK, which did decide to take this different route, which was open to all member states, as you said, but perhaps because of the collective bargaining on the purchase, it was decided that every member state would go through the EMA. And it's all become rather politicized, hasn't it? So when the UK gave its approval to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, Dr. Fauci in the US said, oh, I'm not sure about this, and then immediately retracted because the MHRA, as you rightly said, as all the competent authorities have, are pretty risk averse. They wouldn't be pressurized into making a political statement. And in fact, June Rain, the head of the MHRA, made that point extremely forcibly. And I also think it's worth, where there's nervousness about whether they've gone a bit too far on the risk benefit and looking too much at the benefit, not at the risk. I'm probably similar. I have an interest in science, but I'm not a scientist. But I do know that mRNA vaccines they didn't come untested on humans. They've been used for several years in the treatment of cancers. So they weren't at an absolute starting point. And also the number of people that are enrolled, as I know, the AZ vaccine trial was 42,000 within a few months. So they got the data on many, many people far more quickly than you would expect for, another medicine. So I think there's quite a lot to take into account. I think it's a terrific sadness that it's become so politicized, and we're only looking at in Europe. If you take that further, and I know there's probably more, to developing countries, we need actually an approach that is not so nationalistic but more global.
Thank you very much. Kathy.
Oh, thank you, Frantzeska. I just thought I'd chip in on this discussion about the analysis of the benefits and risks. And I don't think I could disagree in the slightest with what Marco and Sally have said. However, I would add that 42,000 didn't spread very far around different population cohorts. So for instance, of that 42,000, I believe there was only about 4,000 people from Black and ethnic minorities included. So that's a far fewer number. And I believe that there were no tests done according to the leaflets, or at least analysis done on people that were taking other medications. And very little is known about its effects on people of reproductive age. So those are uncertainties that we've had to proceed with in order to get going now. I appreciate that the manufacturers and the regulators included all these points in their leaflets, so it was done with transparency. And I would understand, though, that there will be some people in our community who, in our societies, who might have reasons to be more hesitant than others. We shouldn't assume that there should be a blanket enthusiasm about having any of these vaccines for all people.
Yes, definitely. And there are steps being taken to ensure that the information and training and how the vaccines are actually given are done more sympathetically according to different cultural groups and so on, because going into a big hospital where perhaps you don't speak the language very well and you're just being told to get this and you've heard all sorts of rumors, to actually get a sensible discussion so they can make their own decision. There are steps being, but I accept completely what you say, that it's not perfect, but hopefully it's better than nothing.
Definitely, definitely.
There is a question posed by one of the attendees, so perhaps Marco wants to take it, and it is about the approval process and whether in particular you need that the trials are conducted locally, or you can use data from trials conducted also elsewhere.
Right, good question. And generally, as a rule, there is no obligation to have trials conducted locally in the market where you seek a marketing authorization. There are a few countries that have exceptions. By memory, I could probably say China is one of them, among the major ones that require, at least to some extent, trials to be done locally. But generally, the same data can be used everywhere. Now, depending also on the type of medicine and the specific case, there may be requirements for something like Katie was touching upon, the diversity of the population that's tested. But as a matter of, in principle rule, there is no necessarily a requirement to have trials done locally. And
so
happy if somebody wishes to prove me wrong on that.
No, completely my understanding. So you need a new dossier, you need to put it together, and you might need to present it in a different way, but you don't have, absolutely the whole internationalization of bringing products to market is to ensure that there aren't unnecessary trials carried out just to replicate the same results for another place.
So if we move, oh yeah, Kathy.
Oh, I just thought this might be an interesting point to raise, that there are some big nations around the world that have quite a different system for authorization. I don't know them in detail, perhaps others do, but I wonder about the degree of difference with the data that's required to get an approval, say, of the Russian vaccine. And I only know a little from the media that was a relatively low threshold. I don't know about China, or I believe there's also a vaccine that's authorized in India, originated from scientists in India and have been authorized in India. So I presume it went through their system. So I think there is variation around the world, and it does show that the vaccines that a lot of people will get in the US and Europe and similar Western nations will have had perhaps a lot more analysis than the vaccines that people in much poorer countries will receive.
Yes, thank you very much for this comment, which also brings me to the next question, because when vaccines are approved, then we need to make these available to the population as fast as possible. And this regard, we've had several discussions, debates, and different national approaches with regards to priority order. And Sweden has been one of the countries that has been criticized in general when it comes to COVID-19, not criticized, commented upon, because we've kind of chosen other ways of dealing with this public health crisis and the pandemic. So I'm wondering, Camilla, how is the situation in Sweden with regards to priority order? How does the decision looks like, and what is the legal status for that?
Well, thank you, Frantzeska. Well, looking into Sweden, in Sweden, healthcare, that's the shared responsibility mainly between the state and the 21 regions. And in relation to COVID-19 vaccination, it's the region's responsibility to organize and carry out the vaccinations. The state is responsible for issuing a national plan, including a priority order for the vaccination. And as a result of this, the Public Health Agency of Sweden has published a national recommendation on the priority order for COVID-19 vaccination in Sweden. And such recommendation, it's addressed to the 21 regions, and it is not legally binding, which I will come back to later. The agency has divided the COVID-19 vaccination into 4 phases, describing the order in which different groups of people should be offered the vaccines. And the recommendation sets out that those who have the greatest need for protection shall be offered the vaccine first. Phase 1 includes people living in elderly care homes or people receiving home care, and also personnel who works closely with such elderly. and also adults belonging to the same household as a person receiving home care. And the purpose of prioritizing these categories of people under this very first phase is to provide protection to those who have the greatest risk of becoming seriously ill or dying of COVID-19. And that is considered to be people of an old age and with underlying diseases. And I will not in detail describe phases 2, 3, and 4, but I will give you some information. And people aged 65 or older is one of the categories included in phase 2. And so is also healthcare and care personnel working closely with patients. And phase 3 has recently been specified to include, among others, people aged between 60 and 64 years, but also younger people with a disease or condition that involves an increased risk of infection. And the last phase, phase 4, covers the general adult population aged 18 and over. And as I mentioned before, the national recommendation is not legally binding. The 21 regions shall use the recommendation as a guidance. And it's a guidance for their decision making, and it is intended to constitute a basis for the COVID-19 vaccination procedure in all regions. But each region is legally capable of making independent decisions regarding what categories of people that shall be prioritized, and can also take into account the specific conditions and issues present in that region of Sweden. And the agency's recommendations, they are in general adhered to, and most regions have actually implemented the suggested priority order without any changes. But there are certain aspects of the priority order that have been criticized in Sweden, and some regions have announced that they are considering, in addition to the elderly, to also prioritize certain healthcare personnel in the first phase. And as a response to this criticism, the agency has concluded that actually certain healthcare personnel may be vaccinated earlier than what was set out in the recommendation. And a few regions have already started vaccinating certain healthcare personnel, such as emergency care personnel, in parallel with the elderly in Sweden. And all healthcare providers carrying out COVID-19 vaccinations on behalf of the regions, they shall adhere to the region's decisions regarding the priority order. And in situations where a healthcare provider has entered into a contract with the region regarding the administration of the vaccine, such provider may be found in breach of such contract if it applies an order of priority differing from the one set out in the region's decision. And there are also a number of cases in Sweden where healthcare managers have been criticized lately, and in some cases actually suspended for acting in violation of the priority order by vaccinating, for instance, their relatives. And all EU countries have developed strategies for the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine at the national level, and including a plan for different priority groups for vaccination. And many EU countries have priority order similar to that in Sweden. But in addition, some countries, such as Iceland, Malta, and Cyprus, they have prioritized also workers of essential public services, such as the police, firefighters, and educational institutional workers. But in Sweden, the recommendation or a priority order does not include any other workers of essential public services than those in healthcare and care. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. And how is it on an international level? How is the situation in the UK or in the US? Sally, would you like to comment?
Yes, I've sort of kept an eye on it. I'd say it's broadly similar. There are 9 categories in the UK, And starting, it was very much driven by age, so over 80, over 70, over 60, and then interspersed within the first group, you had healthcare workers. So anyone on the front line in healthcare was entitled to a vaccination, and then carers of vulnerable, then the clinically vulnerable younger people. And there's a certain logic to it. And I think broadly, it's been accepted, although I would say a healthy 25-year-old probably won't see a vaccination until maybe August. But even so, that's okay. It's not without controversy, though. I would say they are adhered to as the national scheme has been rolled out, and I think it's been handled pretty efficiently, actually, by the NHS. Sometimes there are sort of bumps in the road about who's got the right number of vaccinations. When you're giving the Pfizer vaccination, you have to have it in a centre where at least 950 doses can be given in a day. Otherwise, it gets too warm, you can't use it. But there is pressure, for example, to have teachers vaccinated so that the schools can be opened again. Frontline workers such as paramedics and firemen and police, the police force. And then you can get to people on the front line, like shop workers and taxi drivers, having seen the cohorts of people who have been most vulnerable to death or serious illness. It's often security guards and so on. So you can look at what we're doing is rationing when there isn't enough of the product to go around, nor the time to do it properly. And so it will never be completely perfect. I believe in the US there is more emphasis on people doing a job, an essential job, rather than just age. But certainly in the UK, it was clinical vulnerability to, having looked back, who's most likely to die or be seriously ill as a result. And that's how they did the order. An interesting, I think, sort of anomaly, approaching it in a completely different way. In Indonesia, they have done people working in order to get the economy back. If you're part of the working population, then you go first. They say, well, old people don't go out anyway. So there's no perfect way, and I'm sure there are pluses and minuses. And at the end of the day, literally at the end of the day, if there are vaccines left over, rather than waste them, they will sort of give them to anybody who turns up. They certainly wouldn't say, well, I can't give it to you. There has been some controversy about that, where people have been a bit what we call jobsworth and said, oh no, you can't have your second jab because we're not on second jabs. But generally, everyone's a bit more pragmatic than that.
Thank you very much. But I mean, apart from this, deciding the order of giving the vaccines, there are also these fears that one has to deal with related to potential personal injuries due to the vaccines. There are still a lot of people that are worried about side effects, and I'm wondering if there is any compensation regime for personal injuries due to COVID-19 vaccines, and what happens with the liability for vaccine manufacturers, because there must be a great risk for these companies as well. Camilla, how is the situation in Sweden?
Well, in Sweden, both individuals suffering from personal injuries and manufacturers, they are offered certain protection through the so-called Swedish pharmaceutical insurance. And such insurance is quite unique for Sweden. It's a voluntary agreement between companies working with pharmaceuticals in Sweden. And the insurance is financed by the shareholders, which are pharmaceutical companies and R&D companies, CROs and others. And it's financed through an annual fee and a premium related to the company's turnover. And owning a share in the insurance ensures patients using the shareholders' pharmaceuticals, including vaccines and including clinical trial participants. It's ensuring the right to have their injuries and adverse effects investigated, and if applicable, they can receive compensation from the insurance. And although it's voluntary, becoming a shareholder in the insurance, a large majority of the pharmaceutical companies are part of the insurance. But with that said, it should be noted that not all COVID-19 vaccines are covered by membership. And so therefore, the Swedish government is currently preparing a proposal for a new act in Sweden to deal with this and to enable individuals injured by COVID-19 vaccine, which is not included in the insurance, to receive compensation from the government, according to then the same principles as if the vaccine was covered by the insurance. But such act is not in place yet, so until such act is in place, the Swedish insurance will cover compensation for vaccine injuries caused by all COVID-19 vaccines, even if not all pharma companies are members. So the insurance is a protection for individuals, and the insurance offers a more favorable, simpler and less expensive way for individuals who have suffered vaccine injuries to receive compensation than to go to court. And one reason for this is that the insurance is a so-called no-fault insurance, meaning that the burden of proof is not as great as is usually the case in legal proceedings. And it may also be possible to be compensated for injuries caused by known side effects and for which the manufacturer of the vaccine may not be liable to indemnify. But the insurance also provides certain protection in relation to vaccine manufacturers, because in order to receive compensation from the insurance, the individual must transfer the right to take legal action against the manufacturer of the vaccine to the insurer. So indirectly, this means that the individual, by accepting compensation from the insurance, waives his or her right to bring action for damages or product liability claim against a vaccine manufacturer. And therefore, vaccine product liability litigations are not common in Sweden. And the risk for a vaccine manufacturer, I would say, is to be liable to pay high damages should be low in Sweden compared to certain other countries. And it's also worth noting that the calculation of damages resulting from court actions in Sweden are generally low compared to those in other or compared to other jurisdictions. And the compensation for vaccine injuries in Sweden is determined in accordance with the general principles and standard amounts in Swedish tort liability legislation. It's, however, the case that the insurance has certain financial limitations and certain limitations in relation to so-called serious injuries. And serious injuries are when several individuals suffer the same kind of injuries. And following the pandemic's vaccination, there were several demands for compensation reported to the Swedish Pharmaceutical insurance by people that have developed narcolepsy following the vaccination. And these vaccine injuries have been classified as serious injuries. And the maximum compensation amount from the insurance has been limited to 150 million Swedish kronor, which is the standard amount. But for serious injuries caused by COVID-19 vaccines, the liability has recently been limited to a maximum of 20 million Swedish kronor, which is, of course, less than 150 million Swedish kronor. And this is due to international reinsurance companies not wanting to take the risk associated with the comprehensive COVID-19 vaccination campaigns. But as regards the pandemic's vaccination, if we look at that, a law on state compensation was adopted, which enables persons that have developed narcolepsy to receive state compensation when the Swedish Pharmaceutical insurance has reached its limit. But to my knowledge, such a law on state compensation has not yet been discussed in relation to COVID-19 vaccines. But it is possible that a similar law will be adopted, of course, in case a COVID-19 vaccine proves to cause injuries. But that we will have to see.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have some very interesting questions in the Q&As. For instance, how much freedom does the government of each country have in deciding how to distribute the vaccine? For instance, extending the recommended period of time between when the 2 doses are given, which the UK has done. Would anyone from the panel want to comment on that?
I think that's a really excellent question. As you said, we've got some really interesting points, not necessarily ones that we can answer, but it's up to there is some freedom, but I think if you're going against what the manufacturer is recommended, and I think you're making leaving yourself a bit more open to lead on from Camilla's point, to compensation, I would have thought, if it's being, but the manufacturer might say, I'm not liable for that because, it wasn't used in accordance with the label. Having said that, AstraZeneca is now saying, actually, we think 12 weeks might be absolutely fine. So there is some freedom, but I think it's not as simple as the government just overriding what the manufacturer is saying. Also on data, someone's made the point, and if we're talking about priorities, going back to that conversation, and obviously we're not going to go through absolutely everything, but it's worth pointing out that some jurisdictions, including, I believe, Germany and certainly the Netherlands, as has been told, there isn't sufficient data, they feel, to justify using these vaccines on very elderly people. And yet someone else has made another valid point that if it is unproven that use of vaccines actually means that you won't transmit, it sterilizes you against the vaccine, then what's the point in giving it to a healthy 25-year-old and continue to actually prioritize those who are going to become very ill or worse as a result of contracting COVID.
Agree, Sally. If I can just follow up on that, I was also intrigued by the debate between following an approach that is, favors the epidemiological response to the vaccination rather to the public health one. Because if you think that the people that are going around more and they see people, they are younger, they're more likely to carry the vaccine and the infection further, we may want to, vaccinate those people first. But as indeed we don't have evidence that they are sterilized, between quotation marks, it brings us back towards the public health approach, which indeed is what Italy also follows, just like Sweden, and I understand the UK is vaccinating the elderly first, because those are the ones ended up in ICUs, and which is what creates a problem. So I think it's a very good point. And the other comment I had on sort of off-label, member states endorsing formally the use of the vaccine outside the approved label. It takes us back somehow to what I call the Article 5.2 authorization, because if a vaccine is approved in a certain way and the delay between the first and the second dose is what's, let's say 3 weeks or 20 days, whatever it can be, if a member state deviates from that and formally does so, it will, if indeed, issue an authorization to supply the vaccine outside of the particulars that are in the marketing authorization. So either like the UK, you took authorize the supply of an unapproved vaccine, or you authorize the supply of a vaccine outside the specifications in the marketing authorization. And what EU law says in that regard is that the member state assumes the liability, and the manufacturer, the marketing authorization holder, or the health professional will not be liable for anything that happens from supplying the vaccine off-label. So that's sort of, I'm not a product liability lawyer, but that's the contribution from a regulatory point of view to that question.
There is another very interesting question related to that. concerning immunity passports based on vaccinations, and whether this would be a proper supplementary tool to revise travel and similar restrictions to individual freedoms. And I think this brings us also to the discussion on compulsory vaccination in general and the impact. I mean, can an employer force the employees to vaccinate themselves, and what happens if they refuse to do so? I know, for instance, I come originally from Greece. I know there is a new legislation there stating that in order to be able to go to the gym from May and onwards, because now they're closed, you will have to show that you're vaccinated. Otherwise, you will not be able to be a member of a club or so. Yeah,
it's a huge.
Oh, go ahead, Sally.
Just briefly, it's funny. It is very, very topical at the moment because you can see all the implications. Yes, with employees, but also, getting on a plane, going to a gym, going to a club, and in the UK, a minister was saying this is not the UK way of doing it. And he was being pushed, you know, what about for health and safety? And you can see situations where actually it would be advisable at the very least for carers to be vaccinated. But then again, you know, there's some freedom of choice, and if there are people with very valid concerns about whether they are of childbearing age, I know that that's some concern. You know, do you force people to have vaccinations or only live a sort of half life? And I think we're going to see different rules in different countries. Over to you, Kathy.
Yes, I think definitely different rules in different countries, because I think what we might see is some divisions around the world as to whether some national governments are prepared to step in and make vaccinations mandatory in some circumstances, probably starting with foreigners traveling to their countries, and perhaps with certain carve-outs to accommodate some variation in opinion, some exceptions. I think that from the discussion we've seen in the media, there's not an appetite for a governmental approach in Europe. So I think we're unlikely to see that here. So I think that the really interesting question in this patch is whether the law will remain flexible or give people freedom for business owners to choose what sorts of vaccination requirements they require of their customers and their employees. Maybe that there's very little restriction on employers at the moment, apart from them needing to abide by labour law and not terminate their employees without due cause and fitting within the contract of employment and labour law. But they might take some approach that they would find them alternative employment, which might not be satisfactory for the employee's career. So unless policymakers think very carefully about potentially stepping in to slow down these movements, we could see problems. And I think some of the problems are that you were suggesting that it could become discriminatory either ethically or legally for certain groups. If it was legally discriminatory, at least there'd be something that could be done. If it was ethically discriminatory, that leaves them in an awkward position. I wonder, though, whether we need something more formal to slow them down, so that we don't start having people trying to jump queues to get vaccination, or really starting to question fair prioritization. That will bring up more issues about people feeling that they deserve vaccination ahead of others in order to restore their freedom.
I agree, Kathy. And if I can, add by sharing something I read recently in this debate on whether a travel passport could be discriminatory and possibly contrary to EU law. And that's, I think, an interesting point, because you may end up having people living in one country which either has higher purchasing power or simply logistically able to deliver that vaccine more broadly and quicker. You end up having people living in that country, having an advantage compared to people living in another country. So the whole idea could be discriminatory based on where you live in Europe. You may then end up being able to travel before the others, which might be contrary to EU law to some extent. Not an expert in that area, but I just read it in the debate recently.
We have two questions to Camilla. I'm thinking I will ask them now before we move forward to, could we find online the terms of the Swedish insurance? Is that available online, Camilla? Is a question from one of the attendees.
Yes, it's available online, both in Swedish and translated.
Thank you very much. And there is also one question to Camilla concerning those who do not have insurance and very unfortunately develop personal injury. Will they have to leave with? Will they have to leave empty-handed?
Well, as I think I said, the government is proposing a new act to cover all the COVID-19 vaccines. And at the moment, there is an agreement between the government and the Swedish Pharmaceutical insurance that all COVID-19 vaccines are covered. So, I don't think that will happen. But then there is also, of course, if you choose not to go to the insurance, you can take the other route and go to court for the ordinary procedures.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking I will move forward now to another issue that is, of course, of importance in this discussion, and that is the question of patent protection, potentially restricting access. And I'd like to give the word to Kathy. What sorts of patent protection surround COVID-19 vaccines, and how do they affect the global vaccine distribution?
Yes, so we've talked a lot about some of the regulation on these vaccines, but what about the incentives that have been granted to get this research to take place? And how's that going to affect distribution and access? That's really important. I haven't conducted my own first-hand research on the landscape of COVID-19 vaccines. I have done patent landscaping on other topics, but I'm pleased to say that there's actually a lot of interesting, useful coverage available online. And one of the notable features is that there are very few patents on the COVID-19 vaccine per se. But that's not to say that this isn't a heavily patented field. What seems to have occurred is that there's a very complex web of patents governing the platform technology behind a wide range of vaccines. And those platform technologies are relevant to the 10 or so vaccines that have been authorized around the world, and also to the another 24 or so that might be authorized in due course. Within that web, we see patents on things such as the DNA sequences for key parts of the virus, also modifications and combinations of relevant DNA sequences to try and optimize the sequence that will make a better vaccine and get a better immunological response from the human. There's also patents on RNA, so not just DNA, and this is particularly important to the handful of mRNA vaccines that were pursued quite vigorously for COVID-19. scientists having realized over recent years that standard vaccine technology didn't work so well on coronaviruses, so quite a few decided to pursue the mRNA route. So like DNA, there is quite a few patents still in operation. They were filed and had priority dates quite some time before the COVID-19 pandemic, but a patent can last up to 20 years from the date of its filing, and it can give rise, the original priority application can give rise to divisionals and continuations and a family of patents. So there's quite a few patents on things like the RNA sequences and modifications and combinations, different inventions and applied discoveries on RNA expression and RNA immunogenicity in humans. There's various methods for amplifying the RNA and the DNA. And then there's a large number of patents on what are known as vector constructs. So things that deliver the relevant piece of DNA or RNA into the cell of the human. And there's quite a few that the mRNA vaccines, they work in a very particular way using a sort of a lipid nanoparticle. The science is a bit beyond me, but this is quite, this is the kind of key to getting the mRNA vaccines to work, to have to get the mRNA into the human cells so that the human cell then replicates the RNA into relevant protein, and then the immune system can respond. So there's a lot of patents around fusing mRNA with these lipid nanoparticles to get them to go into the cells. Just to give you an example, when people have conducted the landscape of patents over the mRNA platform technology, there's like 113 patent families, and a patent family consists of many more than just a single patent. About 70% of them were filed by industry, or private industry bodies. So that's the majority, and I guess that's what you'd expect. There's still 30% that are not in industry, so there's a blend of public and private there. About 4 companies own 50% of those mRNA patents, and that's Moderna, BioNTech, GSK, and CureVac. So they're 4 sitting over some very important technology now. But that leaves roughly 50% of the patents being owned by other companies. So there's still a lot of fragmentation of the landscape. There's a lot of pending patents. So the full field is not yet known. Some will be granted, but still be subject to successful validity attacks. People might come and argue that they lack an inventive step, that they were too obvious to scientists that are skilled in that field. Already there's some litigation taking hold. There is a challenger against Moderna's vaccine. That's the vaccine that was developed in the US. A company, Arbutus, has alleged that their vaccine infringes one of Arbutus's patents on one of those lipid nanoparticle related patents. And that patent dispute was live even before the pandemic, but now the stakes are even higher. So we're going to see a lot of battles. Probably they won't hit the media, but the general media all that often, except for the really big ones. But there'll be a lot happening in the patents community. There'll need to be various sorts of licensing deals. It's reminiscent of debates around gene editing technology, and any new platform technology with major financial implications tends to lead to these thickets of patent action. Another point noting is that there's been a lot of funding provided by governments upstream to the research, and of course downstream in purchasing the vaccines and putting further money into improvements and so on. So this leaves us with a lot of nuance in the patent landscape, which makes it really hard to decide in any particular circumstance whether it would be fair and on what terms for a country of various socioeconomic backgrounds to insist that vaccines be sold at below a certain price, or that it be compulsorily acquired. And yet, for fair global vaccination, we probably need to do exactly that as soon as possible. So generous licensing, possibly involuntary licensing, but working out what would be fair and reasonable against this very complex patent landscape is really hard.
I have two thoughts here. The one I've seen during the past few days, politicians from different European countries expressing the will to take patents concerning COVID-19 vaccines. Others aiming that there should be some kind of a patent pool constructed for COVID-19 vaccine patents. And also I've seen that there is a lot of discussion concerning transparency, concerning conditions for granting, for instance, loans or other forms of financing, state aid. If you get state aid related to COVID-19 research, then you will need to consent that your eventual patent will be licensed on certain terms, under certain terms. So it seems that there is a lot of attention directed towards the patent system. And do you think that this COVID-19 crisis will bring some kind of political attention to pharmaceutical patents again? Because it has been rather quiet for a number of years after the Doha Declaration and the revision of the TRIPS agreement and so on. So do you think this will be a new era in the general public health debate in relation to patents and pharma, the big pharma rights?
Yes, but whether the outcome will be different. But Sally, it'd be interesting to hear your views on this and from your perspective.
Yeah, so my thoughts are, so it's generally seen this is a global issue and we need global solutions. So the idea of completely compartmentalizing solutions sort of rings slightly wrongly. I could foresee some sort of compulsory licensing, but I think it's more likely that some sort of voluntary arrangement will be reached, possibly like the way that some HIV drugs were licensed on different terms to countries into developing countries. I can absolutely see that. We've seen this sort of trend by the fact that certainly J&J and AstraZeneca have said that they are doing this rollout at cost. So you've already got this sort of completely different attitude because of the nature of what we're dealing with. And to perpetuate any sort of first and second and third world differentiation of access to the right solutions is not healthy. And I mean, I heard someone this morning say, maybe we will see life really rather differently on a global basis because we're all in this together. And it's, maybe the role of the WHO is going to be resurgent again, particularly now that the USA has decided to rejoin. I think it was a retrograde step when they weren't part of the big family, as it were. But I would hope that some sort of voluntary arrangement is reached. Whether it brings pharmaceutical patents generally back into the global, I don't really know. I would say that having been the big bad wolves for so very many years, you know, making profits and so on, they've now been the entities that have brought a potential solution to the pandemic. And I think in the same way that you're saying regulatory law used to be something that would be known by a handful of people sort of struck away. There are so many armchair expert regulatory lawyers and epidemiologists, and everyone's engaged in this. And I think it could, handled well, it could be good, very good news for the pharmaceutical companies, even if they don't make huge profits out of this. I think it's on balance better for their image.
Thank you very much. We have some, Kathy.
Oh, just to complement that with another point, one of the reasons why the pharma industry is often reluctant to price differently across the world is that they're worried about parallel importation, and so the cheap drugs that they sell in less wealthy countries making their way into the wealthy countries. Now, I wonder if the dynamics around COVID vaccinations will be quite different. Unfortunately, it does look like the West will be vaccinated more swiftly, and some of the vaccines don't travel easily. So perhaps there's that reason as well why sensible voluntary licensing will hopefully sort this out. And maybe it will provide an experience that can improve licensing practices in the future for pharmaceuticals. Let's hope so.
Thank you for a great point. We have some questions from the attendees concerning access or vaccination in Africa. Also, the proposal of India and South Africa for a temporary waiver. We have discussed briefly that, but maybe you would like to address it more in detail. Do you think that this is needed, or that, as Sally mentioned, we're in a phase of voluntary agreements and they will start giving effect to the issue of access in developing countries?
So some temporary involuntary licensing, is that your question?
The proposal of India and South Africa, I think they have proposed recently to proceed with some kind of a waiver of exclusive rights in order to proceed to manufacture of vaccines in India and South Africa.
Well, I can certainly understand that perspective, and I think it's difficult to know how that would play out politically, whether it would be better in the long run to work cooperatively with the pharmaceutical industry, or to get, to accelerate production now and rely on strong ethical public policy reasoning. I think that there's not a strong track record in compulsory licensing working out in a way that sort of finds an overlapping consensus between the two bodies. So I worry about that, but it may well be sensible in that it would look very bad from the pharmaceutical corporations for them to litigate, complaining that it was abusing more important property rights than the emergency public health pandemic in those countries. I'm sure they're not. I'm sure the people making these decisions are not going into it blindly. They have the most experience of taking on pharmaceutical corporations with compulsory licensing of any countries in the world.
And we actually have a question with regards to whether there are legal or other instruments which can or should be used to accelerate distribution of COVID-19 vaccines in Europe. We discussed briefly the developing world, but Europe has also issues with regards to access to vaccines in sufficient numbers. So do you think that there are other means of increasing the levels of manufacturing and distribution that have not been tried yet or have not been used?
I think
that's been a topical issue recently too, particularly across the English Channel. At the moment, I think that the bottleneck is not due to patent protection, the insufficiency of supply in European countries. I think it is more to do with the production not being as successful as was hoped, and some manufacturing plants needing to be reset or changes needing to be made. And we can talk further about that if you want, about the AstraZeneca EU dispute and the contracts behind it. There's some interesting issues for law there, and also the ethics.
I think law was seen to be a pretty blunt instrument to be dealing with this situation, actually. And I think after some saber rattling, everybody sort of retreated and took it offline. And some sort of solution was found, but I don't think anyone came out of it looking particularly brilliant in sort of proposing to revoke Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol. I know that's quite a nice little point, but it was quite an emotional political point. I think the EU, to some extent, shot themselves in the foot by making public the AstraZeneca contract, because actually most commentators say they weren't on particularly strong, they didn't have a particularly strong argument to say you've got to redirect it from the UK to us. It's just there isn't enough there, and we need to internationally sort a way of making it fair rather than retrenching into our silos. I wonder if they do it differently in the future, though, of course.
Yeah. Talking about the future, and we have already discussed management of rights, but I'm wondering, Sally, do you think the experiences of the COVID year will affect the way pharma companies and universities enter into contracts with their collaborators, the customers and suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen something different this year, and will this continue? Will it sort of colour the way things are done in the future? So it's very, very common for universities and pharma companies and other companies to collaborate, but they come from slightly different angles, don't they? The university wants to do the cutting edge innovation, it wants to solve big problems, and also has its obligation to publish and to educate and to research and so on. Whereas bluntly, a pharma company is supposed to do the right thing by its shareholders. But I think priorities have shifted somewhat over the last year. Pharma companies aren't putting profits before everything else. And the universities were probably a bit more flexible and even put their own commercial interests on one side, because they can often see a way of monetizing their own investments as well. So I think there's been a lot of compromise this year. Generally, we've seen how well collaborations can work, and how when you've got everyone pulling in the same direction, my goodness, what fantastic results you can get. When you've got the pharma company, the university, or the small biotechs we've seen with Pfizer, and the regulators and the politicians all pulling in that same direction, and people being open to be a subject in a trial, then you can go, you can make a lot of progress, and maybe there is good to come out of this. That there will be more openness, more transparency, and more collaboration. But maybe that's me with sort of rosy tinted spectacles. And as soon as we get past the pandemic and we're working on new things, everyone will retrench into their same positions. And we've also seen a tendency towards joint patenting, which is something that's often makes me a little bit nervous, but I think it's also a symptom of having things working so quickly that the quick fix is often to say, oh, we'll own patents jointly. That may come round to bite us in due course if they haven't really nailed down what that actually means. So yes, I think there will be changes. How many will last long term, I don't know, but hopefully more collaborations.
Kathy, you want to?
Yes, sorry.
No, this flows on well, I think, because it has been a good step that the pharmaceutical companies are trying to do their bit, like everyone is, as far as I can see, and said that they will try to produce the vaccines on a not-for-profit basis. I think what we need to keep an eye on there is there is the hedge that for the period of the pandemic, and this virus is going to become endemic, and we're going to need, I think, vaccinations each year, probably across large sections of the population for at least 10 years, while we all get sort of this herd immunity built up. And I, for one, have been wondering, having looked at the AstraZeneca contract and the EU contract that was published online, I thought that was terrific that they put something out, and there was some redaction. Still a lot that was interesting though. But I did wonder how was a member of the public, interested member of the public, to know how AstraZeneca was arriving at it, and all the other pharma companies arriving at its conclusion that it was doing this at a not-for-profit basis. I think that some transparency around that would be helpful. I think in general, I think we need more transparency on pricing and differentiation in the pharmaceutical industry, and this would be a good place to start. And I saw a good question point in the comments about some reporting that the prices being paid in some less developed countries.
South Africa, I think.
Yeah, was actually higher. And I think, that kind of, if that's what the media is saying, I think there needs to be some response to that and some explanation. I think there could be an explanation. It might be that the media doesn't have full information about, for example, what the UK government has put in towards funding of the AstraZeneca vaccine, or what prices might be reflecting some of those contributions. But I think that really important questions, and if they can't be explained, then something is very wrong in the pricing that's going on around the world at the moment.
Marco, what do you think? I mean, from a regulatory perspective, do you think that the experience of this COVID year will affect the way in which regulatory authorities behave and interact with the industry and with the other stakeholders? Or do you think this is just a notable exception of how things work?
Well, it's a good question, Frantzeska, and thanks for bringing the point up. I will sort of echo Sally's and Katie's comment on the level of collaboration in the industry or between the companies and universities. I think collaboration was a key term in the relationship between the pharma companies and regulators as well during 2020 and the beginning of 2021. And I refer to the accelerated assessment, the rolling review, the sort of the availability of the authorities in working with companies, actually trying to to find a solution. I read a report from the JP Morgan conference, and Pfizer CEO was mentioning how even the FDA was so available, they would pick up the phone right away and follow up. Whereas normally, you know, it's not as a collaborative environment necessarily. And the EMA, of course, is a very respected, regulated, and very pragmatic, but I think he has shown that so much can be done if indeed everyone is aligned and working towards the same results. The EMA created a COVID-19 task force, which is specifically working to support the development and approvals of vaccines and treatments. So it is a very interesting example how things could work well. And I'm not sure if I expect that to be the case in the future, but certainly I hope that this will have learned taught some lessons that can be helpful. Another example, and I think Kathy mentioned the idea of openness and transparency. The EMA is, again, always a very open, to some extent, regulator, even with the public and the scientific community. But, you know, even simply what they've done on their website over the past few months, they have been communicating what was happening, what kind of evidence that they were looking at, how they were authorizing the vaccines, and this idea of being transparent with the scientific world and the public is certainly a positive trend in my view regarding how regulatory authorities work and what their role in the debate is, really to show how they work and be more transparent. Last point, perhaps, even regulators among themselves, they traditionally, you know, they haven't really collaborated. So the FDA does their own, they do their own job. The EMA does its own job. The Swiss authority, you know, they do their own job. And there has been some increased collaborations over the past years, but now even more. And the EMA announced very recently their open pilot initiative, which is an initiative to essentially share scientific information between the authorities of the EU, Australia, Canada, Switzerland, and Japan, I believe, and the WHO. And that's, in my view, the future of regulation. These are global issues, and it doesn't make sense to work in silos, but, you know, authorities should and they will be interacting and sharing information more and more in the future. So I think that's something, again, we've learned that will likely have an impact on how the regulatory process will work in the future.
There is an interesting question from one of the attendees regarding the possibility to choose between vaccines. In fact, the attendee here writes that in Eastern Europe, there are some groups of people that are particularly skeptical about the currently approved vaccines, but would favor, for example, the Russian one. And the question is, what are your thoughts on the right to pick the vaccine one wishes to be vaccinated with?
I think it's, from a public health point of view, impractical. So in the UK, we have big hubs where they do Pfizer, so a big town hall, and lots of people coming from 10 or more miles away. I actually had AstraZeneca, which doesn't have to be kept under quite such careful conditions, and work at my local doctors. But if I was to say I don't want AstraZeneca, I want Pfizer, I would completely mess up the system. And it's a take it or leave it, effectively. We did hear rather depressingly that early on some potential recipients were refusing the Pfizer because they wanted to wait for Oxford, because Oxford would be better because it's British, and you just think, oh. There have been some reports of anaphylaxis following taking the Pfizer vaccine. So if you're very susceptible to anaphylaxis, then you're directed towards the AZ route. But that's not personal choice, that's medical need. So personally, I just can't see how it could happen. Down a private route, yes, if you started charging for vaccines. But at the moment, there isn't a private route to get a vaccine in the UK.
And from a Swedish point of view, I agree with Sally completely. And it's the same in Sweden. You cannot choose which vaccine you get. And it's not administered through private practices either.
And I'm not sure you can do it. Yeah, sorry, Marco. Go ahead.
No, just nothing, I mean, really hasn't been said, but indeed, when it comes to choosing which medicine to take, if up to anybody should be up to the doctor to decide based on their medical knowledge, and as Sally was saying, not because of anything a layman thinks or considers based on the discussion in the press. It would be really wrong if those factors would drive demand. Rather, if a doctor has a medical basis to recommend one vaccine over the other, that's in my view understandable. Of course, these are all vaccines for the same disease, but they're not generics, so they're not equivalent, or just like normally we all know that there may be an innovator and some generics, and in that case the patient sometimes can choose, unless the doctor said that the patient shouldn't choose, but this is a different case. And it should be either probably up to the doctor to decide, if anybody, but not the patient. I agree.
And I mean, I don't think you're able to choose, at least in Sweden, Camilla, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you can choose in other cases the vaccine you want to have. I'm guessing when it comes to other diseases, there must be different alternatives, but are you able to choose?
It's still a medical decision, yeah.
Exactly, so it's not special for COVID-19 vaccines. We have a question here that might be interesting to answer. You mentioned AstraZeneca and JJ agreed to make their vaccines at cost, and that it is better to work cooperatively with pharma to ensure global access. Where do the others, for instance, Pfizer and BioNTech, stand on this? Have they come under pressure to do the same, and how have they responded?
I don't know. I know that J&J is doing the same no-profit approach, but as we've seen, we don't quite know how that works out in practice. But I did see some figures where the AZ was about 1/10 of the price of Pfizer and Moderna. But a lot of that might have been justifiable because, one's much more complicated to manufacture. And of course, with Pfizer, you have to keep it so very, very, very cold. So I'm sure its manufacture is more complicated. But I don't know more than that.
Do the others want to comment on that? No?
I don't know anything more than that either. It's a really interesting question, though, and whether it's got cultural differences, like the corporate culture and the country of origin, Moderna being a US-based, but also how much risk the company took on itself relative to the degree of risk that government and funding agencies shared.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's a very good point. On contracts, I noticed someone had said that the term best endeavours had caused intrigue and interest in Germany. And in fact, this is again looking at the famous AZ agreement. And I've also seen other EU agreements that use this expression. In fact, it wasn't even best endeavours, which under English law is quite an established measure. It was best reasonable endeavours, which to me as an English lawyer is a total anathema, because I don't know what best reasonable endeavours or reasonable best endeavours means. And that's in an English law context. When it is applied, my understanding from my Belgian colleagues is that it was a Belgian law contract. And indeed, in civil law, the concept of using best or reasonable endeavours is most unusual and virtually unenforceable. So it was very unusual to see it and didn't help the EU's case. But maybe one of our civil law colleagues on the call can comment on that.
Thanks. I won't because the firm's involvement in those areas, so it's something I would rather not comment on. It's a good excuse to say I don't know the answer, right?
I might jump in and just something I put in the chat just a sec ago. Is there is a definition in the contract. It's not a full definition, but it gives a bit of a steer about needing to take account of you're working under pandemic conditions and that it is a big company, so it's got to apply itself. I mean, I think if there's a change going forwards in these sorts of contracts, it will be that they'll ask for disclosure of, how many contracts have you actually signed and what did you promise? How many were you going to deliver?
What's a warranty? Is it a warranty? Yeah.
there was a warranty that nothing was in conflict, but
Yeah,
since AstraZeneca thought that it had only agreed to take best reasonable efforts, that none of its prior contracts were in conflict. Maybe it, you know, took the same approach in both. But you know, that's where the rub is, because you know, maybe if they'd realized how many million had been promised somewhere else, or perhaps even the terms of that contract. We haven't seen publicly the UK government's contract with AstraZeneca. I mean, that would have to come out, I suppose, if they did, you know.
Nicola Sturgeon was planning to disclose it, but I think was sat on.
Can I just knowing that our time will eventually run out, I just wanted to offer another perspective after all that, the interesting account of the Swedish compensation scheme was given by Camilla. I was just going to say that the position in the UK is much less generous. We have a vaccine injury compensation fund, but in order to get even a penny out of that, a person has to suffer a 60% disability, and that is given a statutory definition, and it's, although it's not very helpful in the context of the COVID-19 vaccine or any vaccine, the 60% disability is equivalent to losing a hand or amputation at the knee, or losing 60% of normal vision, or because of past experience, we know it's also equal to severe narcolepsy. So unless you're that affected, you get nothing. And if you do meet that standard, you get the princely sum of £120,000, and that's it. And I did a quick currency conversion based on what Camilla had said about the legislation that Sweden is working towards. I mean, I think you said that ordinarily Swedes are entitled to 150 million krona for a vaccine injury.
Yeah, but just to specify, it's not one individual. That was in the series of injuries. So the insurance doesn't cover if it has sort of reached the amount. So that's why the government had, well, there was a new law that the government.
Yeah.
So just to make sure that you
so much more generous. I mean, I think 150 million kronas is 13 million pounds, and even you said the 20 million cap for COVID. Well, that's 1.7 million pounds, and we're a person in England who's supposed to be standing in solidarity and being vaccinated to support others and the economy. If they were one of the unlucky ones, and there won't be many. We really should emphasize that. There'll be very, very few unlucky, if any. But the history tells us that there will be unlucky people from vaccines, or we can't find any other explanation for their serious situation other than the vaccine. And they will get 120,000 maximum. And the reason why it's a maximum in England is because the government here legislated to give immunity against negligence action, so that nobody can bring a negligence action against a doctor or a healthcare worker or the NHS or a pharmaceutical company. And I'm interested to follow up offline with Marco the way that this immunity was put into position. Something he said about the vaccines now having a conditional authorization rather than just an emergency use authorization, whether that might change things. So and I think it does matter because it affects the public trust and the solidarity, and it shows, concern for people who are injured by the COVID pandemic, whether that be through the virus and getting ill, or through the vaccines and trying to come out of this situation.
There is a question in the Q&As that concerns disparities relating to medicine approvals. And the question is if it is time to pursue a path to convergence in this area. And if so, is this realistic? And what would be the most appropriate route to achieve this? And maybe I could ask Marco to begin with. Do you think that there is notable disparity between different jurisdictions when it comes to approvals from marketing authorizations? We discussed briefly FDA and EMA, and
it's an interesting point, and I've been wondering about this for the past 12 years, I think. In my academic studies, I did my PhD in comparative law, and legal and regulatory divergence and convergence is a key topic. It's interesting because indeed you end up having different standards applied to the authorization of medicines across different jurisdictions. I don't think I have an answer, but in the medical device field, it works slightly differently. There is a more harmonized definition at the WHO level. I'm not aware of that existing in the pharma space. I think it's eventually, you know, I don't know when in the future, we may see a sort of a harmonized review and approval of new medicines globally. If I can, you know, think ahead, I don't know how many years. In the shorter term, collaboration between authorities is something that we are seeing. So as I said earlier, FDA, EMA, Japanese authorities, Swiss authorities, they start at least having conversations, exchanging information. As a matter of fact, there is a sort of a regulatory harmonization. But if we want to put it into sort of black letter law somewhere, I'm not sure what the best approach would be, and where that discussion could take place. Very happy to hear the other panelists' comments on that.
My concern would be if you completely harmonized, you might end up with some either lowest common denominator or highest common factor. So you'd either go with the slowest or the fastest, and you might lose something along the way. And I think, again, we've talked about there are different populations. There may be different concerns and different priorities in different areas of the world. So I think to just say, do the same everywhere, we'd lose something along the way. It remains to be seen, and I'm sure you're watching too, to see what the UK does post-Brexit. And are we going to diverge, or are we going to do what is absolutely sensible, which is actually to have some sort of mutual recognition, having shared the same standards for many, many years before why suddenly diverge. But I don't think you can force it on countries to say you have to go with us. It's a question of priorities, and it could become a big behemoth, a really slow process that could actually make access to new medicines even slower. So I think there are downsides, whilst I can see a level of harmonization which is encouraged, is a really good thing. So you don't have to repeat all the same tests just because.
I mean, what we hear from researchers and medical doctors is that this COVID-19 it is unlikely that it will be the last pandemic, and there are fears that we will be facing such pandemics every some years. The question is, will lessons be learned, and what will this be? And we've already touched upon this several times. I'll start by asking Sally, but then maybe the other panelists would like to comment on that as well.
I think that there are so many lessons that could have been learned. I don't think we're there with learning them. I think we need to, someone in this context has used the word humility, that we need to recognize each other's needs and expertise, and also accept that sometimes someone might have got it wrong. It may have been a regulator, it may have been the rollout, it might have been the timing of lockdown. But actually be open to admitting that things could have been done differently. So I think that's one thing. I think we've seen that it's possibly better to overreact rather than underreact. The harsher lockdowns have actually been shown to work, at least to calm things down for a period, but they can't prevent a total resurgence. It only puts it in abeyance. But we have seen some countries which have had a harsh lockdown and had many months of virtual normality, whereas we in the UK have had not really a sniff of normality for nearly a year. I think the question of strong leadership, we've seen where it's gone wrong, and you know, how lives can literally be lost where there is weak leadership, like will-o'-the-wisps or setting the wrong agendas. We've also seen how the underlying health of a population can make a real difference to the outcomes, and maybe public health in a more domestic way can be prioritized as well, so that we have healthier populations who are healthier weight, who get out, all those very sensible things. And I think that's vary from place to place. We need to make sure that people, thinking about vaccinations, it's a very personal thing, and the deaths, the number of deaths and the illnesses, the numbers are so high it can become very impersonal. I think we need to make it personal so that people engage once more. And I'm glad that there has been some movement towards cultural flexibility, and, you know, just recognize that things need to be presented and rolled out in different ways in different organizations. That sounds all a bit miserable. As I said, there are upsides. I think there have been elements of collaboration that have worked very well. And I think I hope it will make us all see this as a global problem, a global issue to be solved, rather than tucking up, because that's only going to be a very short-term answer. We need to solve this together as humanity.
Sally, you mentioned mandatory vaccination, and we have one question about that in the Q&As that I would like to ask. Should people be made to be vaccinated before they can access normal liberties such as travel? If we compare the vaccine schedule in Sweden, for instance, with that of the UK schedule, maybe Camilla could comment to give us an understanding of the different approaches taken by various governments. Some views in the UK suggest that the vaccine schedule is already too high. Essentially, do you all agree that as per the Human Rights Act under IP rights, should society members be permitted to opt out of the vaccine jab should they wish? If not, the social scoring system adopted by China could not be that far away from UK, EU, and the rest of the world. What do you think about that? We discussed mandatory vaccination in the beginning of our discussion, and the impact it could have in employment relations or in other kinds of activities.
We've seen it before with yellow fever. You couldn't travel unless you'd shown that you'd had your vaccination. Maybe that's a smaller, more manageable number. And we're so far away from everyone having the opportunity to have a vaccination. You're going to have two-tier society if we're not careful. But I think there might well be occasions where it is justifiable to say you have to, in the same way that many airlines are asking for up-to-date COVID tests. Maybe the next stage is vaccination, but the very sound of mandatory vaccination sounds a little alien, but we may end up there if we keep coming to wave 940 in 10 years' time.
Would you like to add something, Camilla, Kathy, Marco?
I agree with Sally. I think it will be difficult to have a mandatory vaccination.
Probably.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kathy. Sorry.
So the person asking the question asked if Article 8 would present a barrier to mandatory vaccination. I think that definitely there's a mandatory vaccination would be an interference in somebody's right to a private life. That's generally the case with any kind of, compulsory medical treatment. So then it's a matter of thinking about whether that interference could be justified under pandemic conditions. So there might be an argument that it was so necessary and the interference in all those individuals' autonomy was justified by the public health advantage that we could get. Might be, but I think that argument will get weaker and weaker the more that people voluntarily accept the vaccination and virus prevalence drops. And I don't think there's a political appetite for public authorities to make it generally mandatory. I think if they do so, they'll do so in circumstances where they could really make out that it's necessary and proportionate to protect the health of others.
Thank you. Marco?
Nothing really to add from my perspective, apart from I realize that in some cases, some vaccines are mandatory. I may be wrong because I don't have kids, but I think in Italian schools, at least certain vaccines are mandatory if you want to send your kid to school. So there's probably room to find some balances there. I mean, people get vaccines if you want to travel to some countries for exotic trips. They don't want to get vaccinated for COVID. I think yeah, it's not as straightforward, but there is room to make vaccination mandatory, at least in some areas, I would say.
Mm. But not to participate in ordinary life.
Exactly. You can choose not to.
Definitely traveling is, perhaps reasonable in that we don't have to have overseas holidays. I mean, there'd be circumstances where people do have a very strong claim to go overseas if it's related to their work or to their family life. So yeah, I think this is the difficulty, that it can't be approached on a blanket approach. It's got to be broken down into pockets of issues, I think, and that's what Article 8 generally requires, that one has to be extremely careful about having a blanket policy, because there usually will be a situation where somebody has an Article 8 right where the justification doesn't stand up. And in the UK, we don't have mandatory vaccinations to attend school. There are different cultural approaches, but and I think in some countries, there's the nuance is often in what sort of penalties apply if a person fails to have the vaccination. So they mightn't get access to public benefits, which might be in some cases schooling, or to social security of some kinds, or free medical appointments for their children or things like that. And they may be serious penalties, but there may be ways around it so that it's a difficult choice to make whether you have the vaccine or not, but it's not impossible to live a good life if you choose not to have the vaccine. Whereas if it becomes too much of a universal requirement just to do regular ordinary things unless you have a COVID vaccine, then that does seem much more like a state mandated policy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a great discussion and for all these interesting insights to questions that torment us the past few months. I will give the word back to Eleonora, who would conclude the session.
Thank you very much to all the speakers and the participants for raising so many questions. And thanks so much to you, Frantzeska, for your skillful chairing of this event. So we have heard many things, a lot of food for thought. I would suggest that we conclude on a lighter note, if you agree. The point of these vaccines is for us to get back to our lives or even a better life. So I would like to ask our speakers and also Alex and Rihanna, what is the thing that you look forward to as soon as it becomes possible? What you look forward to doing when this situation is under control?
Having a party. Sorry, it's really base. I love having parties. I always have big summer parties, and not being with my friends and moreover my family has been really tough, and I really want to. My son got engaged and I haven't even seen him, and you know, we don't even know if he's going to be able to have a proper, what we call a proper wedding. So it's all very, very social at my end.
That sounds great. Katie or Marco?
Me. Well, to tie it into the question about, you know, what are some of the things to come out of this pandemic, I think all of the people that have attended today's event and all of the panelists, I think it's reinforced the importance of our area of expertise and the future of this field, and just how important it is for universities and firms to invest in people who are willing to specialize in all these issues and to bring up the next generation. So what I'm looking forward to is having a rest. Although we've been on, you know, home rest, it's been really busy time. And like Sally, if I'm fortunate enough to get a ticket back to Australia, there's a very long queue. I'll go and see my family as soon as
I'll do your swap. I can get my son back and you can go there, okay?
So those are my concluding thoughts.
Thank you. Camilla, Marco?
Yeah, well, what I mostly would like to do is, of course, meet friends and family, and also engage with people in everyday life in a normal way.
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking forward to the most.
Thank you.
Same for me. I think a party and a trip, you know, far away, or maybe a combination of a trip and a party or something like that is probably what I miss the most. Yes, nothing special.
What about Rihanna and Alex? Because, you know, our students, like all the students, unfortunately have had an LLM entirely online this year. So we understand that it is very challenging to do something like this. So I would like to seek your views.
Oh, yeah, let's be able to go to parties and actually to gather with all of our friends would be great. But I have to confess, it may sound a bit silly, but like the thing that I'm really looking for the most is to hugging my grandparents without worrying of passing any kind of diseases to them.
Rihanna, you?
I mean, it's hard to follow up that, but I'd like to visit Sweden. I've yet to go. So yeah, it'd be nice to see the university and yeah, everyone else. So.
Let's hope we are able to hold our graduation in person. And then, you know, you, Frantzeska, what is your biggest wish?
Oh, I think the same as Marco and Sally, having big parties and traveling. And I also think that we have like kind of criminalized hugging and kissing. And in Greece, you know, we have these small tavernas where you sit very close to each other. I mean, even, you know, the tables are very, very close, and you become one big gang of people having a common party somehow. And this is also kind of criminalized. Now we have to keep distance, and we need to. So I'm looking forward to going back to Greece and experiencing the traditional way of having fun, quite close. And yeah, that would be my wish.
That sounds wonderful. So I think that on this note, we can conclude. Thanks again to the panelists, Frantzeska, and all the attendees for making today's session very informative. We will make the recording available soon, so please wait for that. And if you want to know more about IFIM and its activities, please subscribe to our newsletter to be informed about the future events. Thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you soon in real life. Thank you.
Thanks for setting it up. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.